He was not a king. He did not found a tribe. He wrote no psalm, but he was among the righteous and escaped a judgment that marked history with fire. While Abraham built altars in the desert, Lot made decisions with his eyes. While one man's faith guided nations, the other's choices silently and devastatingly shaped destinies. Lot saw angels. He prayed little. He was saved by someone else's intercession, and even so he entered the genealogy of the Messiah. His name does not appear in the songs, but it is found among the ruins. It is not in the prophetic books, but it is on the lips of Jesus as a sign of the end times. But who really was this man who survived the fire and yet remained silent until the end? Why does the Bible call him righteous yet record him among ashes, hesitations, and escapes? And what do Jewish tradition, the Quran, and ancient writings still reveal about him? What did Lot see inside Sodom that no one else recognized? Why was his wife lost between salt and longing? And how did his blood, born of a desperate act, cross centuries to touch the birth of the Redeemer? Before we dive into this surprising revelation, click subscribe and turn on notifications. This ensures you won't miss any of the hidden and profoundly real stories that transform the way we see faith. Now then, get ready to uncover the hidden truth behind Lot's astonishing story. Genesis 13 and 5:11. The silence of the tents was dense like the heat that shimmered over the plains of Canaan. The sound of animals, shepherds, and dust underfoot composed the daily soundtrack of a caravan that had grown beyond expectations. Lot walked among the herds, his eyes always on the horizon, his shoulders bearing a youth shaped by the decisions of others. He was a nephew, not a son. He had followed Abraham from Haran. He had obeyed, learned the language of the heavens, watched altars being raised, heard promises being spoken, but none bore his name. He carried wealth, tents, servants. He had what many desired, but he was still the shadow of another man. One morning a different sound stirred the tents, raised voices, a confrontation between Lot's shepherds and Abraham's. The problem was clear. The land could no longer support them both. The space had become too small for two blessings. There was food, but no peace. Abraham, older and wiser, sought out Lot. There was no accusation, no shouting, just calm words, firm and heavy like a stone upon the heart. Let there be no strife between you and me. We are brothers. Lot did not respond immediately. He looked at his uncle's face, the man who had been his guide, his father figure, his leader. He expected an order, but none came. A choice did. Is not the whole land before you? If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If to the right, I will go to the left. There, in that field among flocks and stones, the silence that had shaped Lot's life was broken. He lifted his eyes and saw the plains of the Jordan stretched out like a living tapestry, green, abundant, watered like Eden. The land from Zoar to Sodom was rich, lacking nothing. The eyes were fed first, then the heart desired. Lot knew where that path led. He knew the city's reputation. But in that moment, the desire for autonomy spoke louder than the fear of the Lord. He sought no counsel. He did not pray. He built no altar. He simply chose. Abraham watched in silence. He did not argue. He did not stop him. Lot separated his tents, guided his servants, led his herds, and descended. Each step toward the plains was also a step away from Abraham. Lot went on alone. For the first time, without shadow on the way, there was no cloud, no thunder, no visible warning, just the high sun and fertile land. But the eyes did not see what heaven already knew. Sodom was beautiful, but corrupt, wealthy, but devoid of justice. Lot pitched his tents in the plains near the city. Not yet inside, not yet entangled, a comfortable and dangerous middle ground. Night fell, and in the darkness, Lot watched the lights of Sodom from afar. They shone like a promise, called out like the voice of the market. He did not sleep early. He sat at the edge of his tent, and for the first time, he felt the weight of having chosen. There was no one left to blame, no one to follow. It was just him and the decision. In the sky, the stars Abraham used to count now seemed farther away, and Lot, though prosperous, felt a cold that even the servant's fire could not dispel. That night, silence returned to the tents. But it was not the same. It was denser, not of obedience, but of doubt, and Lot did not realize the first step toward the ashes had already been taken. The morning dawned gently over the valleys of the Jordan. Mist crept like a veil among the damp leaves, and the wind carried the scent of living water. Lot, standing beside a rocky rise, gazed out over what lay before him. The land seemed to dream. The plains glistened with dew. Natural channels wound through green pastures. The sky reflected in the mirror of the lakes like a visible blessing. The decision had already been made, but his heart was still caught between two landscapes, that of promise and that of pleasure. Abraham had given him the choice, and Lot, even hesitating now, saw too clearly what drew him. The land stretching to Sodom was as fertile as Egypt's fields. Its waters fed herds, its roads led to riches, and its walls offered security. Men traveled there in search of markets, shelter, and prosperity. Everything Lot had learned about faithfulness, submission, and the altar seemed less urgent in the face of such visible abundance. Josephus writes that the plains of the Jordan had a deceptive beauty. The eyes were enchanted, but the feet stepped on soil that hid judgment. Those cities did not fear God. They had culture but no reverence, possessions but no honor, abundance but no restraint. Lot did not ignore this, but he did not confront it either. The justification was simple. He was not like them. He would merely live nearby, manage his business, protect his home. Nothing would force him to be corrupted. He pitched his tents within sight of Sodom as one who draws near without entering, as one who desires without touching. But his heart had already crossed the line. Days passed, and the once sacred landscapes of his time with Abraham became distant memories. No one there spoke of sacrifices nor of eternal promises. They spoke of trade, caravan routes, new currencies. Lot learned other accents, adopted other rhythms. Prosperity came quickly. His cattle grew, his servants multiplied. His name began to circulate among merchants. He started visiting Sodom frequently, at first to sell, then to sit among the city's leaders. He gained recognition, even respect. Some said, "This is an upright man, even among us." Others murmured, "Soon he'll be one of us." But at night, silence returned. There was not always peace in Lot's eyes. His servants noticed. His prayers became scarce. Abraham's name, once spoken with reverence, was no longer mentioned. And the Most High God, the one who had promised lands in countless generations, now seemed distant, not because he was absent, but by choice. The land's beauty stifled the sound of heaven. One night, Lot climbed again to the rise from which he had once looked out. The city glowed in the distance with torches and festivities. A muffled sound of instruments and voices reached even there. He sat on the rock as before, but now with a heavier soul. What he had chosen with his eyes was beginning to weigh on his heart. In the darkness, unknowingly, Lot crossed an invisible line. It was not yet the fullness of Sodom, but it was enough to shape what would come. At the next dawn, the man who once followed a calling without knowing where it would lead, now knew exactly where he was. But he did not know what that land held, nor what would be taken from it, nor that his eyes had already chosen for him become part of his family. It costs nothing to subscribe, and with just one click, you ensure no new story goes unnoticed. Like, share, and help this message reach even more hearts. Now take a deep breath, because the next moment in the story will touch you even deeper. Genesis 19:1. The gate of Sodom was tall, carved from dark stone, adorned with symbols that Lot now recognized effortlessly. It was there that the elders gathered, where cases were judged, where strangers were received or rejected. It was more than an entrance, it was the city's throne. And Lot sat there. He no longer just lived in Sodom now. He was part of its structure, not as a native, but as a respected man. He had gained status. The same Lot who once pitched his tents quietly in the plains now wore fine robes and spoke with authority. His name was mentioned in public decisions. The city's leaders called him friend. His rise was visible and to many admirable, but the glow of public honor hid a different kind of silence. The streets were wide, the markets vibrant, the nights noisy, but there was a void among the sounds, a dull echo, almost imperceptible, that hurt more on calm days. Lot had stopped building altars. His prayers were brief, his hands too busy, and his heart too divided. Sodom had accepted him, but at the price of his separation. Lot's house was large, his servants many. There was security, but also surveillance. No one fully trusted anyone. Lot knew he was tolerated, not loved. He was among them, but not one of them, and it consumed him. In the early weeks within the walls, he tried to keep some distance, avoided parties, declined invitations, but the businessmen insisted. Lot's name was too important to remain absent. "The city respects you," they said. "The city wants you among its own." Gradually he gave in. He was welcomed to the judge's table, heard cases, offered prudent opinions. He didn't agree with everything, but he didn't confront either. He chose to remain silent where once he would have stepped back. He chose peace even without justice. Lot's wife adapted quickly. New clothes, social circles, city customs. The daughters grew up among dances and new accents. The house was filled with voices and laughter, not from promise, but from adaptation. And Lot, though seeing it all, stayed. There were days he looked beyond the walls. He thought of Abraham, of the valley of the altar built between Bethel and Ai. He remembered how the sky felt closer when the ground was simpler. But then someone would call him. A decision had to be made. A favor returned, and Lot went back to his duties. The city did not hate him, but it shaped him. One night, walking the streets before the gates closed, he saw a group of youths dragging an old man. They laughed, mocked, no one intervened. Lot watched, but his feet stayed still. Only when the torches disappeared around the corner did he move. Too late. Once again, he was silent. The next morning, he returned to his seat at the gate. But he was no longer the same. Something inside had broken, something he couldn't even name. Sodom was safe, prosperous, but his soul no longer slept in peace. The city's brightness began to drown out the voice of God, and Lot, even behind high walls and elevated positions, began to forget the sound of the voice that once called him when he still walked among tents and promises. 2 Peter 2:7. The sound of stones being dragged through the streets no longer impressed Lot. The harsh laughter, the shouting at dusk, the insults tossed casually had become part of the city's soundscape. He tried not to hear, but the soul heard it all. At first he ignored the small signs. The rudeness disguised as custom, the violence masked as jest. the constant disdain for outsiders. Lot told himself it was temporary, that he didn't need to get involved, that protecting his own home was enough. But evil doesn't stay still. It moves, grows, touches everything around, and now it touched him. At the judge's table, justice was no longer discussed. It was about convenience, hidden alliances, favors repaid with silence. Lot felt the weight of stares when he disagreed. He was reminded with soft yet threatening words that he was there by concession, not by right. At night, lying in bed, sleep came briefly. Images returned. The woman pushed in the market for no reason. The servant beaten for not stepping back quickly enough. The boy stoned for not bowing. Lot's eyes saw, his soul felt, but his mouth remained silent, and so did the heavens. There were no more visions, no promises, no voice, only a constant sense that something was wrong, deeply wrong, yet without a name, without an answer, without a way out. The sound of the Most High had disappeared, not because he spoke less, but because Lot had listened too much to the city. Peter centuries later would write that Lot's soul was tormented day after day by what he saw and heard, and it was true. It was not a dramatic affliction. It was silent, corrosive, a crack in the soul growing wider with each dawn. Lot began to avoid the parties. The city gate no longer attracted him. He preferred to walk alone by the walls or sit in the shade of his own home, as if he still lived among tents. His daughters asked what had changed. His wife no longer asked. Sodom, once so alive, now seemed like an open mouth over the abyss. But how to leave? Where to go? With what authority? Everything he had built, status, security, reputation was rooted there. His servants were from the city. His wealth circulated through its markets, and his own family had become part of the place. Lot knew that fleeing meant more than departing. It meant breaking, destroying, starting over from nothing. And he was no longer young, no longer a shadow of another. He was responsible for lives, for homes, for decisions that tied his soul to the dust of Sodom. One morning he climbed the walls and looked out at the horizon. Far beyond the Jordan, the memory of Abraham visited him. He remembered the altars, the voice that once said, "Leave your country, your people." Now it was he who needed to leave, but the calling was silent and fear too loud. The city kept on living, trade active, celebrations constant. But for Lot, every street was now a reminder of what had been lost. The silence of God was not emptiness. It was a felt absence, a shadow of judgment, the final wordless warning. And Lot began to realize Sodom would not kill him suddenly. It would consume him alive from the inside day by day. And that would be the worst ending of all. Genesis 19:13. Evening fell over Sodom like a heavy cloth, covering the streets in shades of copper and shadow. Torches began to be lit along the walls, and the city gate was preparing to close. It was the moment when commerce ceased, but the city awakened to its nightly rituals. Lot sat at the gate, not out of habit, not out of duty, but out of restlessness. Something in the air felt different. The wind was colder, the sky denser, and then he saw them. Two men approached. They did not come as beggars, nor as common travelers. Their robes were clean, their steps steady, their eyes alert. There was something about them that could not be explained, but could be felt. Lot rose immediately. He approached, bowed with his face to the ground. The words came quickly before he could even think. "Behold, my lords, I beg you to come into my house. Spend the night there and wash your feet. In the morning you may rise and go your way." The men refused. They said they would stay in the square, but Lot insisted, urgently, as one who knows what the night holds. It was not hospitality, it was urgency. They agreed. Lot led them to his house, ordered water to be brought. Their feet were washed. He served unleavened bread, a hurried meal. His wife's hands trembled as she served. His daughters watched in silence. These were no ordinary guests. The atmosphere was heavy. Time felt tight. But before the meal was finished, the sound came. A sound Lot knew well. Rushed footsteps, laughter, murmurs is rising. Soon shouts knocking at the door. Men from all over the city, young and old. They surrounded the house like beasts. They called to Lot with impatience and mockery. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot stopped. His heart pounded like a hammer. This was no request. It was a threat. It was Sodom in its rawness. No disguises, no laws, no masks. He stepped out, closed the door behind him, took a deep breath, and spoke. "Do not do this evil, I beg you, to these men, for they have come under the shadow of my roof." It was the first time he stood against the city. The first time he did not yield, did not remain silent. He was alone, without a wall, without allies. But something new stirred within him, something ancient, forgotten, now reawakened. Lot, the divided man, stood whole for the first time. His words were not enough. The crowd mocked him, moved forward, reached out their hands, and before they could reach him, the door opened. The two men pulled Lot inside, and the house shone with a light not born of oil or flame. There was blindness, confusion. The attackers stumbled, searched for the door, but could not find it. The guests were not men, and Lot understood. This was no visit. It was a countdown. The city had reached the end of its measure. Judgment was at the door, and he who had hesitated for so long now had to decide in minutes what he had not in years. That night, Lot became a stranger to the city, not by birth, but by choice, and the price would be everything. The sound of the crowd rose like a fever. It was no common uproar. It was the fury of a city exposed, its masks torn off, its true faces lit by the fire of unrestrained desire. Men beat on Lot's door with clenched fists, their voices with hate and scorn. The house had become a target, not for wealth, but for defiance. They demanded, wanted the visitors, shouted names, insults, threats. The night in Sodom had always been dark, but now it became an abyss. Lot, with trembling hands, stood between the door and the crowd, his face pale, his voice firm by instinct alone. "I beg you, brothers, do not do such wickedness." The word brothers came out bitter because they no longer were, if they ever had been. These men were not seeking justice, not conversation. They sought the end of all dignity, eyes lit with lust, mouths open with violence. Lot tried to negotiate, offered his daughters, young, pure, untouched. The words choked in his throat like stones against his own flesh. It was not cowardice. It was desperation, a last attempt to stop the horror. But the crowd mocked, laughed. They did not want the daughters, they wanted the men, wanted to break hospitality, humiliate honor, and deep down punish Lot for not being like them. "This foreigner came to live among us, and now he wants to be our judge," they shouted, "and we'll do worse to you than to them." The Midrash Birsat Rabbah reveals the depths of Sodom. It was a city that hated goodness, despised compassion, punished hospitality. It was not just perversion, it was a doctrine of cruelty. Kindness was a crime, and Lot had just been declared guilty. The first stone was thrown, it missed, but others followed. The gate groaned, the wood gave way, and then the door opened from within. Lot was pulled in. Strong arms grabbed him. The visitors stood, but they no longer seemed like mere men. Their eyes burned like hidden lamps, their hands firm as carved stone. They stretched out their arms toward the crowd and blinded them, not with darkness, but with confusion. The men staggered, screamed, groped at the walls like those drowning in a sea without bottom. They searched for the door, but could not find it because judgment had already begun. Inside the house, silence was heavy. Lot leaned against the wall, his chest heaved, his daughters wept, his wife stood paralyzed, but the visitors were calm. One of them spoke. "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, whoever you have in this city, take them out of here, for we will destroy this place." Lot tried to understand, but there was no more time. The words came as sentence. The city had cried out against heaven for too long, and now its measure was full. Outside, the crowd still thrashed, but they were no longer a threat. Inside, the last righteous man in Sodom was being called to leave, not as punishment, but as salvation. The time for choosing had ended. Now it was time to flee. Genesis 19:15-17. Dawn arrived without relief. There were no stars in Sodom's sky, only low, thick clouds, still as an omen. Inside the house, the oil lamp flickered. Lot's daughters gathered what they could, a cloak, a waterskin, crumbs. His wife laced her sandals with slow hands. Lot did not move. The angels stood. The voice came with force. "Rise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But Lot hesitated. His eyes, still clouded from the night before, wandered through the house. The wooden chest, the rug brought from Haran, the saltstones his wife loved so much, the traces of all he had built, all still there, all still standing. How to leave without looking? How to depart without saying goodbye? Lot's mind screamed, but his feet did not move. Then the angels took them by the hands, not only him, but his wife and daughters too. It was no longer a choice. It was mercy, a rescue by force. Like a father pulling a child from fire, like a shepherd snatching a sheep from the edge. They left the house, left the street, left the city. Behind them the air changed. The wind trembled, the ground exhaled. Something in the sky groaned like a gate broken open. But the angels spoke and their voices cut through the darkness. "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stop in all the plain. Flee to the mountain lest you be destroyed." Lot stumbled. His heart beat out of rhythm. The daughters ran silently. The wife sobbed softly. Every step was a battle between attachment and obedience, between what was left behind and what might still be lived. The ground beneath their feet felt hotter, the horizon ahead more distant. The city behind, so familiar, was now a collapsing prison, and still the desire to turn back to look one last time burned like fever. Lot did not look, not out of strength, but out of command. The angel's words burned in his mind. Do not look back. It was more than a command. It was judgment upon the soul. Whoever looked chose to stay, even walking with their feet. Their heart remained chained to what God had already condemned. They climbed. The city descended. Flames began to cut the sky. They were not lightning nor thunder. They were columns of fire falling like liquid justice. The earth groaned. Sodom's walls shook. And behind them the world they knew turned to ashes. Lot did not look, but he heard. He heard the explosion, heard the screams, heard the end, and he ran. Not because he was strong, but because for the first time he understood what it meant to escape with your life. The order was clear. There was no turning back, no looking, no choosing, only fleeing in dust and judgment. The escape continued along the bare slopes leading to the mountain. The steps were short, urgent. The wind blew ash, and the heat rose from the earth like furnace breath. The sky behind them burned, not metaphorically, but with literal fire. The city of Sodom disappeared under flames, not sent by man. Lot led the way. His cloak clung to his body, his eyes fixed on the horizon, teeth clenched to keep from screaming. The daughters followed close behind, eyes sunken, hands joined, and the wife, she hesitated. Each step dragged, not from exhaustion, but from rupture. Something inside her remained in Sodom. The house, the dresses, the scent of spice she used in her hair, the friendly voices, bronze, mirrors, the laughter of warm nights. She fled with her feet, but her heart bled backward. The angel's words still echoed. Do not look back, but she looked. It wasn't carelessness, it was attachment. She turned her face just for an instant, just to see. But the look was not just visual. It was whole. Body, mind, and desire turned. And there, between one step and the next, she stopped. The wind shifted. A sharp gust from the edges of the salt sea passed over her like a silent blade. The heat turned to stillness. Her limbs froze mid-motion. Her skin lost color. Her eyes, their shine and salt sealed her, not with explosion, but with silence, like a memory, like a standing gravestone. Lot felt it. He did not see it. He didn't need to turn. The space behind him felt silent in a way the whole world understood. Something was missing. Someone had stopped, and it was final. He did not cry out. He simply continued. The Quran tells that the wife of the Prophet Lot was left behind, for she belonged to those who refused. She was with him but not of him, shared the house but not the destiny. The command was clear and partial obedience was not enough. Lot now walked with fewer steps, with one more emptiness. The woman who once crossed the desert with him was now a statue, an immobile witness to what the heart chose. The daughters wept silently, but the father did not stop. The mountain was still far, the fire still near, the ground smoked, and he knew judgment does not pause for mourning. As he climbed, Lot thought of the decisions he never made fully, the small concessions, the silences that did not confront, all he tolerated until Sodom entered his home. Now it was too late. There was no return, no burial, no body, only salt and memory. At the top of the mountain, when they finally stopped, day was breaking, the sky tinged with fiery red. Smoke covered the valley, and there, at a point where human eyes should not return, something shone motionless in the distance, not like gold, but like a warning. Lot fell to his knees, not out of sorrow, but out of ending. Because that day he did not just lose a city, he lost what he loved too much to leave behind. Genesis 19:30. The Jordan Valley burned in silence. Columns of smoke still rose from the ground as if the earth itself were mourning. No birds crossed the sky. No sound echoed except the wind slicing through rocks and the distant rustle of withered leaves. Lot walked with slow steps, leading his daughters along paths that were not roads. They were dirty, burned by dust, eyes hollowed by pain and absence. They had fled with their lives, but without a home, with salt on their shoulders but no direction. Zor had been the first attempt at shelter, a small, fearful city that did not dare challenge the heavens. Lot entered with respect, seeking shade and rest. But there, fear spoke louder. Suspicious glances followed them. Whispers came from behind doors. There was bread, but no peace. And so he left again. He climbed the mountains, not by command, but from weariness. The caves opened before them like cracks in the stone. Cold, dark, deserted. They were not a home, but they were silent. And Lot needed that. There was no city anymore. No wife, no familiar voices, only rock, shadows, and memory. There among the stones he stopped. He did not return to Abraham. He did not seek the tent where he had once heard promises. He sent no message, called no one. The shame was too deep, the pride still alive, and perhaps deep down the fear of hearing what he already knew. He had been spared but not victorious. The daughters did not ask questions. They had already wept all they could. The father, now silent, was a figure of survival, not of direction. The days passed like slow drops. The sun rose over the rocks without warmth. The nights were long. There were no songs, no sacrifices. No altar was built at the entrance of the cave. Lot, the same man who had followed Abraham by faith, now survived by inertia. The silence of destruction was worse than the fire, because it burned from within. The hands once full of flocks now only searched for water among rocks. The feet that had walked city gates now felt their way along rough, cold ground. Inside the cave, time stopped. Memories came like lashes. The choice of the Jordan Plains. The first glance towards Sodom, the night he tried to protect and failed. The wife turned to salt. Each decision carried weight and now no return. Genesis says Lot was afraid not only of what had been but of what was to come. The world he knew had collapsed. The neighboring cities were gone too. What remained was a new wilderness, but without divine direction, without promise, without voice. The cave then became a metaphor, not just shelter but reflection. A man hiding from himself, a righteous man but broken, a survivor with no destination. And there among the stones, the last visible link of the covenant breathed, not to move forward, but only to remind that sometimes living is the only sentence left. The sky remained silent, and Lot no longer asked. Genesis 19:31-36. The cold of the cave was constant, stone upon stone. No fire warmed the thoughts. The days were the same, and the nights even longer. The destruction of Sodom had become a distant noise, but in Lot, the ruin was internal, ongoing. He survived, but did not lead. He breathed, but did not dream. The daughters, silent, watched. They lived between the mourning of their mother and the fear of the end. There were no men, no people, no promise, no visible future. Everything they knew had been buried under ashes and salt. And there, in the darkness of the mountain, the plan was born. The eldest spoke. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to come to us according to the custom of all the earth. It was not desire, it was desperation. The lineage needed to continue. The bloodline had to go on, even if by a path no law would permit, no altar would bless. And they decided. They prepared wine, mixed it with silence, served it on the cave's makeshift table. Lot drank a lot, not for pleasure, but for forgetfulness. His eyes closed, his senses faded. He did not speak, did not resist, did not know. That night the eldest daughter lay with her father. There was no passion, no words, only the naked act of urgency, only the continuation of the name at any cost. Lot did not know when she rose. The next day, everything seemed the same, but something had been planted in the womb and in history. The next night they repeated it. The wine, the numbness, the darkness. Now the younger daughter, the same cave, the same father, the same silence. And another seed was sown. Genesis is clear. Lot did not know when he lay down or when he got up. No word came from his mouth. No memory reached him. That night would never be told by him, but it would be written in the names. The eldest gave birth to a son. She named him Moab from the father. The younger also bore a son, Ben-Ami, son of my people. 2 sons, 2 peoples, and a single origin. The loneliness of the cave, the fear of disappearing, the silence of a father who had lost the city, the wife, the direction, and now the authority. Lot never cursed, nor did he bless. He did not instruct, nor did he rebuke. He was a father without knowing, and the sons born of his sleep would walk the earth with marks that would span generations. The story does not judge with fury, but it does not forget. Moab and Ben-Ami will be remembered. They will be nations. There will be neighbors and rivals of Israel. And it all began with wine and night. In the cave, silence returned. Denser, more definitive. Lot did not leave, did not rise again, did not build an altar. He was now only a man among stones and consequences. The righteous one who remained, but who no longer spoke. If this story moved you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel now. It's quick, free, and makes all the difference in reaching more people. Let's continue together. The next scene is already waiting for you. Deuteronomy 23:3. Time passed in the cave as if the world had stopped. The voices of Sodom had been swallowed by ashes, and no new voice had emerged since Lot lived among shadows. He had survived judgment, survived the salt, survived the wine, but he had conquered nothing. He merely remained. The daughters were now pregnant. The eldest belly grew first, then the youngest. No one commented, no one asked, no one judged. Inside the cave, silence was law. The father, now also a patriarch, said nothing, not because he didn't know, but because there were no words left to touch what could not be undone. And then they were born. The first came into the world on a cold morning. The mother's cries echoed through the rocks like a lament. A boy, strong, healthy. She looked at his face and gave him a name. Moab from my father. No attempt to hide, no historical disguise, just the raw truth. The son of necessity, the son of fear. Days later, another birth, another life. The younger daughter also gave birth to a boy and named him Ben-Ami, son of my people. Another name that bore what the night could not conceal. The wombs of Lot's daughters bore not just sons, they bore nations. They bore futures that would bring deep consequences. The biblical text is concise, but its words weigh like stone. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Deuteronomy 23:3. The marks of origin were not erased. The blood born of desperation would always be remembered, not with hatred, but with caution. The 2 boys grew up amid nothing. No city, no people, no neighbors. They were sons of the mountain, sons of silence. They grew up with a father who did not smile. A man who fed them, clothed them, watched them, but never told them stories, because the stories were trapped in nights he dared not revisit. Lot was now 3, father, survivor, and shadow. He built no tents, dug no wells, sought no lands. He simply remained. His hands, which once guided flocks, now shaped stone tools. His feet, which had walked alongside Abraham, now never left the slope. He was a man among sons, but without a voice. The daughters didn't question him either. The new structure was accepted out of necessity. Roles were defined, pain was set in stone, and time simply passed. Lot's sons would not inherit Abraham's blessing. They would not be counted among the tribes of Israel. Their names, when mentioned, would be remembered at a distance, and yet they would be there on maps, in wars, in treaties, and in wounds. Moab and Ammon would become kingdoms, strong, restless, often hostile, and it all began there. In that stone hollow where 3 people fell silent before the world, Lot wrote no songs, left no teachings, made no covenants, but his lineage would cross the story of redemption, even if through crooked and unexpected lines. Still, at that moment, he didn't know, nor did he wish. He simply existed like someone who has given everything they could and still breathes. The caves held the memory, the rocks witnessed it, and the salt left behind still seemed present in the taste of Lot's life. A taste that would not fade, that did not sweeten, only lingered. Moab and Ben-Ammi were born of fear, but they would not die forgotten. They would carry the marks of a night no one told, and of a father who never spoke again. Lot's name passed through generations with a strange aftertaste, neither cursed nor blessed, only laden with silence and weight. A righteous man according to some, a survivor according to others, but never celebrated. The Talmud in Sot 10b mentions Lot with a mix of respect and caution. It is said he had merit for maintaining hospitality even in Sodom, but his choices, his hesitation, his lineage are always remembered with a but, as if Lot's righteousness was never full, never whole. His name doesn't appear among the patriarchs, no tribe claims him, no altar bears his signature, and yet he appears as a warning, as a boundary figure, as the righteous man who lived among darkness and nearly let it erase him. Moab and Ben-Ammi grow up, become men, clan leaders, founders of peoples. Their mothers, also their sisters, do not hide their origin. Their names carry it. Their existence, though accepted, is never normalized. They are sons of a father who did not bless, of a silence that did not heal. The mountains no longer contain them. They descend, build cities, erect walls, create systems, are acknowledged by neighboring kings, but never integrated into the heritage of the promise. Israel knows them, knows where they came from, and keeps them at a distance. In Deuteronomy, it is written that no Moabite or Ammonite may enter the assembly of the Lord, and this decree echoes as a sentence over Lot's memory. His sons become nations, but not brothers. They grow parallel, not allied. They are relatives by flesh, but foreigners in faith. And Lot, the man for whom Abraham interceded, the man who saw angels and escaped the fire, becomes the symbol of what almost was, of the inheritance that could have been, but was lost at the edge of the path. Life in silence continues. No text narrates his death. No burial is recorded, no final blessing. He vanishes between chapters, disappears as he arrived, carried by another. The generations that follow do not curse him, but neither do they invoke him. Lot's name hovers in memory like one who lit a torch and let it fall before the flame fulfilled its purpose. But the Talmud insists there is merit, the hospitality, the courage to open the door, the plea before the crowd. It was not nothing, and because of that, his descendants, even rejected by Israel, would one day touch the thread of the covenant, because from Moab would come a woman named Ruth, and Ruth would change everything. But Lot didn't know that. In his time, there was only the weight of difference, the echo of what didn't return, the inheritance not passed on, the sons who walked far from Abraham's tent, the altar that was never built, the God who was no longer invoked, and the man who remained. Lot had done everything to live but not enough to belong. The cave, the wine, the sons, each part of the story formed a bitter spiral, not of condemnation, but of distance. He was the righteous man who almost got lost, and the story kept him that way, not to erase but to remember that surviving is not the same as inheriting, that leaving Sodom doesn't mean Sodom left entirely, and that some names remain not for what they achieved, but for what they almost ceased to be. Genesis 19:20-29. The Jordan Valley, once covered in green pastures and abundant waters, was now a barren plain, ochre-colored and reeking of dry sulfur. Nothing grew, no shadows moved. Birds flew high to avoid the region. Caravans took detours. Shepherds told stories to their children, warnings, almost legends, about cities that dared to live without limits. And at the center of it, ashes. The ground, still warm in some spots, exhaled invisible memories. It was as if the earth spoke, not with words, but with absence. The void left by Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities was more eloquent than their screams. Abraham had risen early on the morning it all fell. From above he saw the smoke rising like a furnace, a judgment without divine sound, only fire and end. But he didn't go down. He didn't search for traces. He simply prayed and trusted that if there was one righteous, he would be spared. And Lot was, but the valley remained. Genesis 19:28-29 records that God remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the catastrophe. Lot's deliverance wasn't by his own merit. It was a response to intercession. The judgment that fell on the plain didn't stop for him. It stopped for someone far away who was still praying. But Lot's memory wasn't taken with him. It remained among the ruins. Like an echo, the region became a symbol, a space made sacred by destruction. Those who passed through avoided looking. The elders said the ground still breathed judgment, that beneath the dry crust were the houses, the markets, the gates that once welcomed strangers, never to let them out again. The ashes spoke, and among them the name of Lot, not as a hero nor as a villain, but as a memory. The man who was saved without an altar, who left without crying out, who saw the angels but didn't follow them afterward. His name echoed not as praise but as a question. What remains of a righteous man who sat among the wicked? What is left of a man who walked with Abraham but planted roots where God did not dwell? The earth didn't answer, but the wind whispered. The cracked rocks seemed to guard the warning that no prophet needed to repeat. Around the valley, traditions emerged. Travelers would throw handfuls of soil away as they crossed its boundaries. Some removed their sandals, others simply passed in silence. No one made a home. Lot, wherever he was, no longer walked there. His feet left the scorched ground, but the echoes followed him in memories, in his children, in the lost look of the nights. The once fertile valley, the same one his eyes coveted at the beginning of the journey, was now proof that not everything that glitters is a blessing, not everything that grows endures. The ashes do not lie. They are witnesses of choices, of omissions, of delays, and of mercy that rescues but does not rebuild what was consumed. Lot's name was not erased, but it remained etched in the dust of history as a sign, as the name whispered quietly by those who fear repeating the same path. Sodom fell, the valley dried up, and the voice of the past still echoed over the stones, reminding that sometimes the greatest echo of a life is not what it builds, but what it survives to remember. To Peter 2:6-9, he is remembered as righteous, not for grand deeds, not for prophetic words, but for anguish. According to the second epistle of Peter, Lot was considered righteous because he was tormented day after day by the unrestrained lives of the men of Sodom. A man tortured inside, a soul that even surrounded by wickedness still knew how to discern what was evil and suffered in silence. But he was a divided, righteous man. His heart had been in Sodom, his eyes had coveted the plains. His steps led him to the city gate, and even seeing the decay, he stayed for safety, for comfort, for fear of starting over. The text doesn't say, but the conflict is in every gesture. Lot did not build altars. He did not intercede for the city. He did not cry out for justice like Abraham. He saw, felt, and remained silent. A righteous man who didn't shout. A believer who didn't witness. A wounded soul, but unmoved. In Sodom, he gained status. A place at the gate. Recognition. But he lost discernment. He became a figure of contradiction, respected by outsiders, but invisible to the heavens. And yet God rescued him. Peter writes that God knows how to deliver the godly from trials. And that's what he did. He took Lot by the hand because of Abraham's persistence, because of mercy that surpasses merit, because of grace that reaches even those who hesitate. But the conflict didn't end with the escape. Lot remained divided. He survived the fire, but didn't return to fellowship, didn't rebuild an altar, didn't reconnect with his uncle, didn't seek the promised land. He entered the cave and stayed there. The righteous man who escaped judgment, but did not find rest, because the division wasn't just geographical, it was internal. The eyes saw the promise, but the feet trembled. The mind recalled righteousness, but the body sought shelter. The soul recognized God's presence, but the heart had learned to live with silence. Lot knew Abraham's God, but he didn't seek him like Abraham. He walked beside the promise, but not within it. And that made him an uncomfortable mirror, one who knew the right, but lived in the almost. The man who was saved, but without inheritance. And that tension marks his story. No later book sets him as an example of faith. No genealogy celebrates him as a patriarch. No psalm cries out to the God of Lot. He appears, yes, but always as an exception, as a warning, as a reminder that righteousness without conviction becomes survival without fruit. But God's justice does not ignore those who are anguished. The same God who destroyed the cities of the valley extended his hand to Lot, not because of his strength, but because of his sorrow. Because though divided, he was still sensitive to evil, still wept in silence over what others celebrated, still feared, even without the courage to flee. And that was enough to be rescued. The righteous man in conflict was taken from the fire, but he carried the ashes with him. His story, made of hesitant choices, painful omissions, long and silent nights, remains recorded not to exalt, but to warn. Because there are righteous who overcome, but there are also righteous who merely escape. Genesis 18:23-33. The sun was leaning over the valley when Abraham stood before the Lord. The wind blew hot among the tents, but the greater heat came from within. He knew what was coming. He knew because God himself had chosen not to hide it. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? It wasn't just judgment, it was farewell. Abraham listened in silence, then he stepped closer. There was no rehearsed plea, no formulas, only a cry. He, a man of dust and ashes, dared to lift his voice before the Most High, and his voice trembled, not for himself, but for those below in the plains where Sodom slept unbothered. Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? The question was more than rhetorical. It was hope dressed as argument. Abraham knew Lot was there. He didn't know the state of his heart. Didn't know if he still remembered the altar, but he prayed like someone holding the rope of someone already falling and refusing to let go. If there are 50 righteous, God listened, answered. Abraham lowered the number 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, not out of indecision but out of mercy. He was seeking space for grace, a gap in the justice that was coming like fire. And God, patient, listened to every word, every number, every pause. There were no promises, no guarantees, but there was silence, a silence that accepted. And when Abraham stopped speaking, the Lord left, and he remained alone, looking toward the valley, his heart heavy, his soul poured out, the prayer spoken. Nothing else could be done. The intercessor came down from the mount with moist eyes. He didn't know if it had worked, didn't know if Lot was still alive, but he knew he had spoken with God, and that was enough. In the plain, nothing changed that night. Sodom's lights shone as usual. Laughter echoed through the streets. Merchants packed up their tents, men drank, young people danced, and Lot was perhaps already asleep. But the heavens had already decided, and if not for Abraham's prayer, there would have been no survivor. Genesis is subtle yet direct, and it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that he remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the midst of the destruction. It was not for his own righteousness, not for his strength, it was remembrance, it was intercession. The prayer of one man saved another who no longer prayed. Lot never knew the details, never knew of the conversation between Abraham and God, never knew that his salvation began before the angels arrived, before the gate was shut, before the city was touched by judgment. He was rescued by a prayer he never heard, but that heaven never forgot. Sometimes grace acts like that. Silent, preemptive, deserved by another, poured out on one who had already given up asking. Abraham returned to his tent. Lot fled to the mountains. Their paths never crossed again. But between the two there was a bridge made of words spoken in the dark, lifted with faith. Judgment fell. But before it an intercession fell, and that was what separated Ash from continuity. One man prayed, another lived, and God remembered. Lot's name disappears from the narratives like dust in the wind. No death record, no monument, no final blessing. The one who escaped the fire faded into silence, but his memory didn't. Flavius Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities does not omit what Lot's eyes saw, nor what his choices produced. He recalls that when Abraham gave him freedom to choose the land, Lot did not consult God. He only looked at the plains. His eyes desired what was fertile, rich, beautiful, and he went down. But whoever goes down without an altar moves away from the promise. The land that looked like a garden became a furnace. The city that seemed abundant became ash. The security that looked like stability became ruin. And the choice that seemed like freedom became a prison. Lot was not just inattentive. He saw with human eyes, decided with logic, planned with worldly wisdom, but the promise never depended on logic. It depended on obedience. The consequence didn't come at first. It came gradually. First the loss of separation, then the silence of the soul, then the distancing from Abraham, the absence of an altar, the closeness to evil, and finally the ultimate price, Sodom. He was spared, yes, but not without scars. He lost his wife, lost the city, lost direction, saw angels, but did not follow them beyond escape, had children without having a choice, saw nations born of his blood, but not from the blessing, and he was never mentioned again. Josephus acknowledges that Lot chose well in the eyes of men, but also recognizes that this choice sealed his fate. The story does not curse him, but distances him. His name is not repeated in the genealogies of faith. There are no descendants among the tribes, no legacy among the patriarchs. There is, yes, a trail, an echo, a reminder that a choice begun with the eyes ends in tears. Lot lived long enough to remember, to see his children grow with names carrying the weight of shame, to hear stories about the land he chose and lost, to look at mountains he never descended to exist among memories without being able to rewrite them, and that was his price. He was not consumed by fire but by what remained after it. The life that continued without direction, the faith that was never renewed, the story that was never completed. Choice carries weight. The plains of the Jordan were beautiful, the city was lively, trade was strong, the people bold, everything seemed perfect, but their God was not. And divine absence, even when invisible, has consequence. Lot did not seek evil. He simply approached it without resistance. And when he wanted to resist, it was too late. The righteous man who sat among the wicked, the host of angels who didn't pray for his city, the rescued one who did not return to the altar, a man of faith but without pilgrimage, of righteousness but without testimony. The story calls him an exception, but every exception one day becomes a warning. Lot was not forgotten, but he was remembered with weight because his life cries out what many still whisper. Not every choice leads to a fall, but every choice has a price. Psalm 83:8. The sons of Lot grew up among stones and shadows. They did not inherit Abraham's tent. They did not know the altar. They did not learn the name of the God who brought their ancestors out of idolatry. They were born of silence and were shaped by it. Moab the firstborn. Ben-Ami, I called father of the Ammonites. Both were raised far from the fertile valley their father once chose. They grew up without roots, without inherited land, without a defined people, but with blood that carried contradiction. They were sons of a righteous man, but also of judgment. The surrounding peoples knew who they were. They knew the origin. They knew the cave. And because of that, they avoided them, not just out of disdain but out of fear. Because even distant from the promise, even outside the covenant, they carried something from within, something not entirely worldly, something unsettling. Psalm 83:8 mentions them among those who rose against Israel. Moab and Ammon are among the conspirators, those who seek to erase God's name from the earth, not as absolute strangers, but as resentful relatives. They knew the boundaries of the blessing and lived outside them. Moab grew and became a kingdom fertile, strategic, politically strong. Its gods, its practices, its alliances with other pagan kingdoms pushed it even further from the silent root that came from Lot. But the name was never erased. Ammon also grew. His sons became warriors. They resisted Israel, attacked, were attacked, rejected the prophets, mocked the laws. But from time to time their origins returned like a whisper in battles. They are sons of Lot. The phrase was not a curse nor an honor. It was a burden, a reminder, the invisible seal that made them part. But from the outside, like someone watching a house through the window, knowing the blood is the same, but the key was denied. Lot's silence echoed in them. There are no records that they invoke the name of Abraham's God. No altars, no covenants, only presence, constant presence at the margins of history. Unsettling presence, unforgettable. Israel could not ignore them, not because they were accepted, but because they were always there on the map, on the path, in the Psalms of Lament, in the war decrees, in the fear of kings. God himself imposed limits. The sons of Lot would not enter the assembly until the 10th generation, but he also ordered they not be destroyed nor attacked without cause, because even so they were relatives. This tension defined them. Moab and Ammon were not just nations, they were reminders, they were mirrors. They were the living consequences of ancient choices, of unspoken nights, of a righteous man who did not speak but begot. They lived on the margins but were never erased, and this paradox followed them. They had righteous blood, but oppositional behavior, a saved father, but a conflicted future. They were children of silence, of the unspoken, of the unrevealed, and that haunted them, but also protected them. Because in decisive moments, God would remember, not because of their merit, but because of that name, buried in the dust of history, but never forgotten. Lot, the divided man, the anguished righteous, the silent survivor, and his sons, though distant, could never fully escape their father's shadow, nor the mark of having been born amid fire and grace. Matthew 1-5. Time passed over Moab as it does over stones, shaping without haste, wounding without warning. The nation grew far from the promise. Its wars, its kings, its idols, all kept it apart. But in the womb of history, a seed rested. Centuries later, among the parched fields of Bethlehem, a Moabite woman would cross the boundaries of scorn. Her name was Ruth. She was not a prophetess nor a matriarch. She had no sacred lineage. She was a widow, a foreigner, unexpected. But her decisions would rewrite the course of generations. Her loyalty to Naomi, her humble silence, her boldness in Boaz's fields. Each step she took was a thread being woven into a garment unseen but already being sewn by heaven. Ruth, daughter of a cursed people, became a mother of redemption. And then the lineage blossomed. Ruth bore Od, Od bore Jesse, Jesse bore David, and from David would come Christ. The Gospel of Matthew does not omit, does not disguise. In chapter 1-5 it is written, Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab, Boaz begot Od by Ruth, Od begot Jesse. Ruth is there, named, remembered, honored, and with her Lot. Because if Ruth is a Moabite, then Lot is her ancestor, the man who survived the fall, who lost everything, who was saved by another's intercession, who begot sons out of fear, who remained silent to the end. From him, from his daughters, from his pain, would come long after, a name the world would never forget, Jesus. The genealogy of salvation runs through men like Abraham and David, but also through Rahab, Tamar, Ruth, and hidden behind them Lot, the man who did not return, the man who did not finish, but whose lineage continued. This is the sacred irony that weaves through Scripture. God writes with marked lines. He restores broken names, redeems bitter stories, and turns what was born of fear into a source of hope. Lot didn't know. He never knew. He died in silence, without an altar, without honor. He was remembered by the prophets as an exception, as a warning, as the shadow of the righteous. But his children, even from afar, carried a trace that time could not erase. And that was enough. The Messiah, the Lamb, the King would have Moabite blood, Ruth's blood, Lot's blood. Redemption would not ignore those outside, would call them in. On the cross, the whole world would remember Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But heaven remembered Lot too, because even those who hesitate can create paths. Even those who fall silent can leave traces. Even those who flee can be remembered. And the lineage of salvation is also made of echoes, of exiles, of survivors, of those who lost everything, but were included in the end. If this story made you feel something different, don't wait. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and share it with someone who needs to hear it, too. Here, every click spreads faith and hope. Now, we return to the heart of the plot. Luke 17-28 minutes and 32 seconds. Lot is not forgotten, but he's not celebrated either. In Scripture, his name appears like a shadow, never among the patriarchs, never in the promises, never in the songs, but also never erased. In Luke 17, Jesus himself speaks of him not as an example of faith, but as a sign, as a warning. It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. Remember Lot's wife, that's how he is mentioned. In the middle, between daily life and judgment, between routine and collapse. A man who left and whose wife couldn't follow. A name placed between mercy and warning. Jesus remembers him but does not praise him, and that says a lot. Lot is the righteous man who hesitated. The host of angels who had to be dragged. Abraham's relative who never built an altar. The man who was saved but voiceless. Redeemed but not restored. His name appears on the Messiah's lips as testimony of a time when the world lived without hurry, without fear, without discernment. Sodom on that day did everything it had always done, as if heaven weren't about to collapse. And in the middle of the city, Lot, the only one who left. But even in leaving he lost. Lost his wife, lost his land, lost the line of promise. He was left with memory, with his daughters, with the weight. Jesus mentions Lot's wife, not for who she was, but for what she did. Remember Lot's wife. She looked back and turned into a statue. Because those who hesitate before obedience freeze halfway. But Lot didn't look back. He walked, he left, and that was enough. The Bible never calls him a traitor nor wicked, but it also never calls him a friend of God. He didn't build altars, didn't receive promises, didn't cross rivers by faith, didn't climb a mountain to sacrifice a son, didn't build an ark, didn't defeat giants, didn't prophesy to the people. But he also didn't bow to the gods of Sodom. He was there between error and intent, between escape and remorse, between the inheritance he lost and the lineage he left, a name in the middle. And maybe that's exactly what makes him eternal. Lot represents those who know but do not follow, those who fear but do not transform, those who escape but do not build, those who are saved but do not bear fruit. His faith was enough to leave but not to build a new altar. Jesus himself acknowledges him as a figure of the end, because there will be days when humanity returns to eating, drinking, selling, planting like Sodom, and there will be salvation, but few will see, few will hear, few will leave. And among those few, the ones with divided hearts will walk with heavy steps like Lot. The mention of his name in Luke 17 is not for veneration. It is for remembrance, to teach us that judgment can come upon the ordinary and that the righteous can be silent. Lot in the end is a mirror, not for the heroes of faith, but for those saved by a thread of intercession. He is there among the names, never exalted, never forgotten. A name in the middle, one step before the fire, one thread before the end. Nothing was born there again. The land where Sodom once stood turned to ash, salt, and coagulated dust. It didn't sprout, didn't bloom, didn't breathe. As if creation itself had sealed that place, as if the soil rejected any attempt at a new beginning. The Quran in Surah 11 declares with severity, "And when our command came, we turned that city upside down and rained upon it layers of hard clay marked from your Lord, and they are never far from the wrongdoers." It wasn't just any collapse, it was a reversal. The city was overturned, disfigured, not just destroyed, undone. Every stone, every street, every shadow of what had been now served only as a reminder. The ashes whispered judgment. The hills around seemed to keep silent by divine obligation. Sodom would not return. The men returning from the desert deterred. The shepherds who approached lost their sheep in the dry valley. Mothers told their children stories and forbade them to play nearby. This land was touched by fire that didn't come from a lamp, and no one dared to plant. But the memories it grew. Lot didn't return either. There was no home for him anymore. Not among the living of the city, nor among the children of the promise. He was the man who left alive but lost everything. His wife, his house, his voice. He walked, breathed, fed his daughters, but built nothing more. There were no cities for him, no plan, no tent. The silence was now final and carried within it the echo of all that was left unsaid. Sodom didn't return, and neither did Lot. What was once a living city became a memorial of destruction. What was once a man with choices became a figure of warning. The wind passed through the broken stones and whistled like an ancient lament. Birds flew too high to land. The soil wrinkled with cracks displayed the punishment without needing explanation. And the surrounding peoples began calling the region no man's land. Not the Ammonites, not the Moabites, not the Hebrews, not the children of the desert. No one claimed it because they knew their God had spoken without words. And when the Eternal speaks like that, the world listens forever. The city Lot chose with his eyes would not rise again, nor would the man Lot was before it. Sodom, with its wide gates and active trade, was swallowed by its own weight. The arrogance of safety became a trap. The disregard for compassion became a sentence. The idolatry of unrestrained freedom collided with the limit of a God who still reigns. And Lot saw it all, but rebuilt nothing. Didn't return to Haran, didn't send word to Abraham, didn't go down to Canaan, didn't raise an altar. The city fell all at once. The man fell into silence. In the Quran Surah there's a final reminder. The stones are never far from the unjust. Because divine judgment is not limited by geography. It hovers, it watches, it reaches. Sodom will not be rebuilt, not out of forgetfulness, but out of justice. And the one who left alive, left to remind that there are choices that don't come back, lands that don't rise again, paths that can't be retraced, and names that survive only to remind what must never be repeated. The pain of the righteous is not the pain of punishment. It is the pain of seeing what others do not, and still not being able to stop it. Lot was not like the men of Sodom, but he also was not like Abraham. Scripture calls him righteous, Peter affirms it, Hebrews echoes it. Not with his name, but with his shadow. The mention of Noah in Hebrews 11:7. By faith he built an ark to save his family reflects a parallel line. Lot also saved his household, not through active obedience but through silent fear. Both escaped total judgment. Both were the only ones among many. Both left before the fire fell. But between Noah and Lot, there is a chasm. Noah built something. Lot fled from everything. Noah saved by faith. Lot by mercy. The pain of the righteous is not only in what they suffer, but in what they carry. Lot saw the angels, saw the city fall, saw his wife turn to salt, saw his daughters conceive from their own fear, saw the promise pass without touching him in return. He lived but never rested. Lot's soul was tormented, says the epistle, every day, by the injustice around him, by constant wickedness, by unrestrained corruption. He did not applaud it, but neither did he fight it, and that conflict consumed him. He was righteous but divided, sensitive but passive, saved but empty. Time did not heal, escape did not restore, survival did not bring comfort. Lot lived on the edge between inherited faith and a settled life. He knew what was right, but chose what seemed safe, and then could no longer return. This is the pain of the righteous who do not prevail. They see evil, know the cost, but stay. And when they finally leave, they carry the pain of what they saw and the weight of what they didn't do. Lot did not build an altar, did not leave a legacy, did not receive land, did not seal a covenant, was not visited again, had no descendants among the children of the promise, but he was spared. And that is enough for heaven to call him righteous. Because there are righteous ones who conquer lions. There are righteous ones who cross seas. There are righteous ones who face kingdoms, and there are righteous ones who simply survive with their soul intact in a broken world. Lot was that. His pain was that of one who knew the true God but was surrounded by false voices. His pain was that of one who knew the way but no longer dared to walk it. His pain was that of one who lived but never rested. Not for lack of faith, but for excess of conflict. The righteous man who sat at the gate, who offered shelter, who interceded from within, but never fully left, and when he finally did, it was too late for everything except escape. Hebrews speaks of a cloud of witnesses, of men and women of faith, of victories, of fulfilled promises. But between those lines hovers the echo of Lot, not as a hero, but as a warning. Because not every righteous person triumphs. Some simply survive, and even that in God's judgment is counted as righteousness. No one knows where Lot was buried. No tomb holds his bones. No stone bears his name. He entered the narrative with tents and servants and exited it with the silence of one who survived beyond what he could explain. But his trace remains not in monuments but in ruins. Sodom was overturned, burned, sealed under ashes that allowed no rebuilding. The land itself refused restoration, and with it remained the name of Lot like living ash, like a warning that does not fade. Bereshit Rabbah 515, one of the oldest commentaries of rabbinic tradition, to reflects on Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. They say she remained standing, visible to all, as a reminder that incomplete obedience is disguised ruin, and beside her, invisible but present, the silent legacy of her husband, the righteous man who left but never returned. Lot had no epic ending, no reunion with Abraham, no return to the tent, no final blessing. Only distance, only absence, only two sons born from fear and the echo of a condemned city. But even without a clear ending, there is legacy. Ruth, the Moabite, would carry in her eyes the red thread that would cross generations. She never knew Lot, never saw Sodom, but bore the inheritance of those who survived by mercy. Ruth did what Lot did not. Left the land, embraced the God of Israel, found refuge under wings she did not know, and the world was changed through her, because from Ruth came David, from David came the Messiah, and from the man who fled in silence came redemption. Lot's legacy is not found in achievements, it is found in warnings. He reminds us that not every choice is reversible, that what we see can be deceiving, that silence in the face of evil is not neutral, that fleeing is possible, but costs everything. Lot loved a plane, lost the city, trusted logic, and found himself alone in caves. Even so, he was spared, not because he was strong, but because he was remembered. Lot is the name between Abraham and Ruth, between promise and fulfillment, between the altar and the ruin. His legacy is the weight of decisions. He was not cursed, but neither was he exalted. His life cries out to those who follow. Choices shape destinies. Eyes don't see everything, and hesitation is costly. He is the man who saw angels, who stood against the mob, who escaped the fire, but did not return to faith. And even so, his lineage touched the Messiah. Because God does not erase names for failures, but he also does not build stories on omissions. Lot's ending is obscure, but what he represents is clear. Righteousness without conviction, faith without endurance, salvation without fruit, and even so redemption touched his lineage. This is the paradox of grace. It remembers the righteous who did not prevail. It honors the faith that hesitated and redeems dust with eternal promises. Lot was lost among ruins, but his story remains between warning and hope. And don't leave just yet. More amazing stories are waiting on your screen. Click stay with us and dive even deeper into the secrets the Bible holds. Thank you truly for walking with us this far. You're not just watching, you're part of this mission. See you in the next